Welcome to the presentation on China and hopefully ways to help you work that market better. We'll get started right away. So I'd just like to open with a statement that having a China strategy is very worthwhile today. It's not just because this market is highly valuable, it's just that without a strategy, your chances of succeeding in that market are very limited. So lots of people want to make money from, Okay. Lots of people want to make money and do well in China, but there are very few that do. And so early in this presentation, I'll just address the fact that you've probably noticed that I'm not Chinese. And, but I have worked in China since 2013, and I've been working for 2 different Chinese publishers for the last 4 years. And for them, I have done deals with overseas companies, including game sourcing, ad monetization, and 2 acquisitions, one of a studio and one of an ad tech company. So actually this presentation is just a summary of about 1,000 or more conversations that I've had at shows like these with teams that are trying to figure out China. And so far I can tell you almost every company on the planet is trying to figure out China. Almost nobody has got it figured out yet. So I like to think of the China gaming market as a gold rush in the sense that it can make millionaires overnight, but at the same time it's almost nobody that achieves that kind of success. And so that's really because the market itself is quite complex, and also it's very, very competitive. It's not an easy win. And consequently, you don't actually see that many Western companies do well in China directly, and vice versa. You don't see many Chinese companies do well in the West either. I might have missed. So there are opportunities for Westerners. The market's challenging, but there are signs that things are improving. You will see at shows like these at least between 6 and 20 different Chinese companies now circulating. I'm sure there are at least 6 here today. And in the other way, I see in China every single show, including China Joy, tons of different Western companies come to figure out China. So the communication that's going on in the last couple of years has greatly increased over maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So the opportunities to do business are better and better. That doesn't mean the barriers are gone. It's still complicated. Android's a bit of a mess. It's several hundred channels that replace Google. And there are content approvals required. You're not technically allowed to publish directly into China yourself. So a quick outline of today's topics. I'm going to open quickly with a bit of a market overview of China, and then I'm going to jump into these what I would call 5 categories of or ways or places that you can improve your China strategy. Each one of those has between 1 and 5 different things you can do. The first one being content-oriented. If you have some market intel about what people in China are actually playing, you can maybe modify your game design or your imagery or your use of language and so on to improve your performance in China or to make your game more attractive to Chinese publishers. Second would be self-publishing. There are ways to, of course, self-publish on iOS. There isn't really a barrier. Apple doesn't cooperate with the Chinese government in forcing you to use a China publisher. So in that sense, you can get iOS out with, on your own effort. That doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to get a good result, though. Third, of course, is you can use a local publisher. There are probably several dozen that you could or should know about, and there are probably hundreds in total. The giant ones are Tencent and NetEase, but there are a whole bunch of publishers beyond those 2 that are quite easy to work with and much easier to find and get a hold of. Past how you publish, there are ways that you can actually improve monetization in the market. So ad monetization, for example, is the best when you're using local demand partners. For the last couple of years, if you were just using the large international ad networks, as an example, you might have left 50% of the available money on the table. So there are big gains available there. And then the last category I've kind of dumped into tips or do's and don'ts that can, quickly, give you some actionable steps about how to improve things. And I'll do a quick recap at the end. In terms of China market, it's still big and attractive. I think since 2016, it's been the #1 game market in the world. I think globally it sits at about, for 2018, $35 billion in total, of which almost $20 billion is for mobile. And if you think about mobile, it's because 1 in 4 smartphone devices is in China. So 25% of the market, or 800 million devices or smartphones, are available. And it's also a very mobile-first culture, so it's the ideal situation for mobile to do well, if you happen to be a mobile developer or a mobile publisher. It's also a very distinct market, so online content is regulated. You're not supposed to have any blood. You're not supposed to have any anarchy in the streets. You're not supposed to use real maps. You're limited in the ways you can use GPS. All these different things come into play when you're trying to get your game approved for that market. On top of this, the ecosystem is different. You probably heard it before, but there's no Facebook, there's no Twitter, there's no Snapchat, no Instagram, no Google, no just about anything social. It's replaced by an ecosystem of Chinese apps that do the equivalent. So WeChat, Weibo, Youku would replace, say, YouTube. About the only one that's really in common between the two markets is now TikTok. So TikTok is just as popular in China, it's called Douyin there, as it is in the West. Another thing that's happening in China recently is that there's a regulatory overhaul. So the amount of new content since March of last year has been really restricted. Maybe only several hundred games in total over the last 20 months have been approved for publishing. So they've done an overhaul. They're trying to reduce the amount of screen time for kids and other things. And but that overhaul and the new system really isn't in place yet. And so the hope is that in the next few months or early 2020, that'll be done. First of the 5 categories. Sorry that I'm rushing, but every time I practice this presentation, it turns out to be 30 minutes, and I don't have 30 minutes. So you can ask me questions later if I've gone too fast. So in terms of what people play, MMOs and RPGs, they lead in terms of market share. So there's a very loyal audience of those kinds of games in China, and those users pay real money to play those games. So any kind of game that's heavily IP supported, higher LTV games, the Android channels and even Apple like those games because they're earning a rev share on all that money. And so in terms of the places that games can get promoted, those are the games that dominate that space. That doesn't mean that casual games or ad-supported games aren't doing well. They're also doing well, but they are more challenged because generally those games don't have the kind of LTVs that the MMOs have. Within the casual game space, which is where I've worked for the last 4 years, the match 3 mechanic is still hot, so everyone's watching for that next game that might have a new twist, fresh content, but still uses the match 3 content mechanic. Puzzle games, arcade games, action games, endless runners, strategy games, they're all still doing well in China. What I wanted to really highlight, though, is China is so big that even the niches can be the biggest market for you. If you happen to make premium games, there will be China publishers here, myself included, that tell you premium games don't tend to do well in China, or hidden object games don't tend to do well in China. But I can give you live use cases of where those games find their biggest market in China. So maybe it's not that those games are the top trending games in the market, but there's still so many people there that can convert into a very large number. So don't ignore the niches. It actually might be the best place to position yourself for new games. And don't listen to everyone that'll tell you that just because you're not making a match 3 game, that maybe has the potential to hit 300 million downloads or something like that. There are lots and lots of niches that pay well in China. And in terms of doing research on what's trending in China, you can use lots of different tools. That one at the bottom, Data Magic, happens to be the one that I use. But basically any tool where you can quickly go through the ranking list of the games that are doing well, and you can quickly look at the store assets, you can look at the videos, you can download those games and see what they look like, see what they feel like. You can very quickly get some first-hand intel on what's happening in the market. In terms of self-publishing, iOS is available. Yes, you won't be compliant. Yes, you may not get any downloads. But you can certainly do it, and if you don't have an alternative, I mean, why wouldn't you? Android, you're largely locked out. You really have to use a local publisher to reach Android. Almost all the devices in China are really not on Google, and so you really will miss that market entirely, and that represents about 2/3 of the devices in China. One problem is that you might have a hard time finding an Android-only publisher. So to make it more attractive, you might have to bundle iOS and Android to make that publisher interested in promoting your game in China. There's also a factor of unauthorized publishing. If I throw my game out on iOS and Android globally, and I throw it out on iOS in China, and it's popular or it's fresh or something, I've got lots of examples of how publishers notice that a little bit later, some of their games have started to show up on Android in China without their approval. So that's a very frustrating thing that still happens. And it's really a product of the fact that the largest Android user market in the world isn't connected directly to the largest Android content portal in the world. So, the sites over there are just trying to help people discover content, but then there are other people that, unscrupulously grab those URLs and they reverse engineer how to make ad revenue off those games. The only way to prevent that is actually to be present in the market yourself. So this segues into using a China publisher. It's about compliance, but if you pick a good publisher, the trade-off should be worth the cost. So using a publisher, the bad news is that you will give up between 50 and 80% of the money. It's the terrible truth. But better to get 20 to 50% of the money that is significant than to get 100% of nothing. So that's really the math that you've got to evaluate. Is working with a publisher going to be worthwhile for you? I can tell you there are publishers, even from this region here, that probably have little incentive to work with a publisher for iOS because they've got such a famous brand that chances are they're going to get featuring well beyond any Chinese publisher that could take over that title. So for them it's a bit unique, but for everyone else I think you should at least consider using a publisher. These are the typical benefits that you'd pick up from doing so. The other part of using a publisher is that there are some challenges. One, they're not all that easy to find or communicate with. So you may know them, but maybe you don't have a contact. Even if you have a contact, that contact often changes. The process is slow. You're seldom dealing with the decision maker. These sorts of challenges can make working with a Chinese publisher a bit frustrating. The process, though, is pretty straightforward. You submit your game. Eventually, if the interest is there, you'll get to a contract. You can protect your IP by keeping the code if you want, and make the dev work yourself. Or in most cases, these days, people are handing their code to the Chinese publisher to make the dev work. The game gets localized and launched, and you earn the money. It's that straightforward. The fourth category of making more money or doing better in China is monetizing better. So to monetize Android, you have to have a local publisher. It both gets you the user base, but also the ability to monetize those users. There's no other way to do it. It's also the only way to displace any of the hijacking and unauthorized distribution that goes on. Also, ads revenue, I don't know if you know it, but ads revenue in China is often higher than in the US these days. 4 years ago, it used to be a tier 3 market, but now it's definitely a tier 1 ad market. You can make a ton of money on ad monetization. Between $20 and $100 per 1,000 rewarded videos. So it's quite attractive. And also you need to know China user preferences, how they use IAP, and what their tolerance for ads is. The do's and don'ts, really quickly, inform yourself and network through these trade shows. I think there are at least 6 companies here. Download WeChat, connect with these reps, ask them for referrals to other companies if they're not interested. Use LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, almost all of the Western BDs for China publishers are available on LinkedIn. You're not going to learn much from the company websites unless it's a Western-facing publisher. Many of the Chinese publisher websites are not that informative. The local trade shows, Pocket Gamer does one in, I think, Hong Kong or Shenzhen. Also the Game Daily folks, the Casual Connect show, they also do a show in the South. But the big show for China is China Joy. And I can tell you that at China Joy, I can meet as many Western teams as I can meet at the GDC. That's how, well, it's not that there are that many there, but there are that many of the sizable companies coming to China to investigate how to do better. Create a publisher list for yourself. It wouldn't take you long to put together 24 or 36 names. Get to know what they publish. It makes it easier to circulate your test flights or explore whether a team is interested or not. One of the last things would be recalibrate your expectations. China is not easy to do, so don't expect to do it quickly. Just take your time and chip away at it, and eventually you'll do better. As a final point, if you're going to use a publisher, consider bundling iOS and Android together, unless you're Plagendary. Because if you aren't Plagendary, that's the only way you're going to get the maximum marketing budget, is to have both of those platforms with one publisher. This is almost the same sort of stuff. Network, meet the reps today. For publishers, consider the more Western-facing ones. It might make your work a little easier for China. iOS China, if you have a large iOS audience and want to make more ad revenue, you can talk to me after or ping me on Pine. For China Joy, some countries actually sponsor teams to go and experience China Joy. So it's actually fairly common. I would investigate whether that kind of funding is available. The show happens every August at the beginning, and it's a really terrible time to be in Shanghai, but it's a good, interesting show to come to if you're wanting to do better in China. Game submissions, once you have that list together, it should be fairly quick to circulate games for review. And it's all a numbers game. The more publishers you know, the more places you can circulate your titles, the better chance that you're going to have a team to work with. Last 30 seconds, it's a market that's worth the effort. It's all about getting the content right. If you localize well, including how you monetize the game, you have a much better chance of doing well. You need to work with a publisher to reach the whole market, including Android. And if you do all those things, hopefully you'll make a pile of money in China. Thank you very much.